It's great to welcome back to the program today Aaron Lasher, who is co-founder and chief strategy officer at BRD. Aaron was on the program a little while ago. Time flies. I don't know what, I guess it was like, was it 6 weeks or so ago? I don't even know exactly at this point.
Yeah, I only count days in the price of Bitcoin. So really, I don't
Well,
know.
we'll get to that. So listen, I mean, I think this will be an interesting conversation. So we've talked before about how we have sponsors on the program, particularly the YouTube channel, that are in the cryptocurrency space. Some are ICOs, some are not. And last time you were on, we were clear BRD was a sponsor of the David Pakman Show. And most of my audience sort of gets that we have sponsors in order to have a show, and most people sort of understand how programs are funded and they get media and cryptocurrency, et cetera. But very often I will also get emails from people saying, David, you really got to challenge some of these crypto people more because there are sort of real serious questions about the viability and security and efficacy of the crypto space. And lo and behold, Aaron said that he's glad to have that conversation. So is that sort of a good setup for our talk today?
That sounds great.
Cool. Okay, good. So let's get right into it. I mean, one of the things that I hear very often from people in the audience when we talk to folks from the crypto space is, David, you will sometimes mention as an aside the issue of mining and the environment, but you've got to take that on much more forcefully as a program that advocates for reducing our carbon footprint and trying not to do damage to the one planet on which humans currently live. So I mean, let's start there, Aaron. This is a concern for many people who may believe in the viability of cryptocurrency conceptually and politically, but they have the environmental concerns over electrical use for mining. How should we approach that conversation?
Those seem like, I think those are valid concerns, but it's really important to put everything in context. So I guess there are a few points I would make. The first is that it's really not as bad as people think. A lot of the mining is located in places that have really cheap hydropower. So if you look at, I think some of the more popular locations are the Sichuan province in China, Washington State, Iceland, and a lot of mining is actually very green. I don't have exact figures for you. I don't think anyone really does. But the first thing I would encourage people to realize is even if you just look at kilowatts or kilowatt hours or whatever measure of power that the network is indeed consuming, a lot of that is renewable and doesn't really have a carbon footprint. The second would be, I think, some justification for it being worth it. So that's more of a comparison of what does Bitcoin and cryptocurrency provide to the world, and are we willing to pay some environmental cost? My position is yes, but I'm happy to debate that with anyone who disagrees, and I know why they would.
Well, before we go further, if I can, just because it can be hard to kind of go back and look at these one by one, I think it's
Sure.
important that we should recognize that hydropower, there's not a consensus that hydropower is, quote, renewable. I mean, I think it is under the umbrella of what we would call a green energy, so to speak, or non-carbon based energy. But the renewability, it's not always considered a renewable. And in some sense, I mean, it is something that at least in particular locations we can run out of. But I think I understand the point that it is not burning fossil fuels.
Oh, well, you can educate me on that. I assumed that hydropower was relatively stable and reliable, but I guess you're right. The rainfall has an impact, and I'm not a hydropower expert, but yeah, I'll have to look into that some more.
Yeah, I mean, I
But
think the
fair
general, just
distinction.
so
Fair
so my
distinction.
my understanding of it is that it's clean, and in the sense that it doesn't pollute the air and it's not burning fuels. Although, of course, you know, the creation of the hydropower plants may be a factor there, but that it is not an endless cycle of electricity creation on the basis of water's movements on the planet. But we're both, I think, starting to get away from, you know, sort of like our
Sure.
core competency on that particular issue.
And I'm completely ignoring the environmental impact of actually making one of these power plants. And I know
Sure.
there's a lot of work around that. So
Yeah.
if you'll just sort of humor me for now, I'll acknowledge those concerns, but
Fair.
basically saying it's not fossil fuels in large part. And And then I think the second one I mentioned was whether it's worth it.
Yeah.
That's a little bit more of a subjective conversation. Maybe one way to get to the bottom of that is look at what Bitcoin can replace, because it's not like the financial system we have today is completely cost free or power free. What we have, even down to the buildings in Manhattan, all of these have a carbon footprint, and in many ways are made redundant by a sort of mature and useful crypto economy. But my position is that it is worth it, even acknowledging some carbon footprint. I suppose a third point is that it will get better. Specifically, that the amount of mining is related to the inflation rate of Bitcoin, which goes down over time. And then it will take a while, but 10, 20 years from now, presumably we might actually be using quite a bit less power to secure the network. So that's another piece. And then, I guess I think I'll just leave it there. Those are I think counterpoints that I hear the most often. But I'm happy to dig in if you think that one of those is interesting.
Well, I think the most interesting one from the point of view of someone who would be called like an antagonist of cryptocurrency, so to speak, as some in my audience are, would be this issue of what is it worth it? And everything has an opportunity cost. Obviously, anything we do has not only a direct cost, but typically there's something else we're not doing, or something that on the back end is not taking place. And I guess with cryptocurrency, what I hear from some in my audience is it's not totally clear to them how this apparatus of cryptocurrency doesn't detract from the stability of government currencies. Now, if you are not a particular fan of government-backed currencies, and you can point to issues with government-backed currency, you might see that as a positive for cryptocurrency. But for the majority of people who are in Western democracies, both on the political left and right, with exceptions, for the most part, they are comfortable, at least, if not actively in favor of, sort of operating businesses or selling their time to an employer, specifically through government-backed currencies. What would be the strongest case to be made that should be rethought?
This was one of the reasons that I was really pleased that your show reached out to us to invite us on the show. And actually, maybe if I may, I'd like to address the sponsorship issue. It really does go both ways. In the same way that I think you take care to only allow sponsors and to promote products that you yourself are comfortable with, or even use yourself, which I respect. We're the same way. We don't want to be associated with brands or channels that don't make sense for what we're doing. So there's a mutual respect there. But where I felt like you were being treated unfairly is that you're very transparent about your sponsors, and it's very clear the relationship that you have with them. I think you do a great job of promoting the brands because you at least believe in or trust the sponsors that you choose to work with. I didn't see as much. So just to be clear what I'm talking about, it was a minority of your viewers, but some of them were very, very negative about your choice to sponsor or let a cryptocurrency company sponsor your show.
Right.
And I thought that was totally unfair, because I don't see that pushback with like Linguist, right? No one seems to get upset with your other sponsorship choices. And I thought there was an opportunity there to just explore that a little bit if you wanted to.
Well, I think it relates to what I brought up, which is that with something like Linguist, which is a language learning service, for just to pick one since you picked that one,
sure,
it's very hard to build any kind of even reasonable case against learning an additional language, right? And so I think that where a lot of the conflict comes from is that there is a perception from many that cryptocurrency is not the sort of equalizing, democratizing force that some claim it to be. And if you question that, then you question, well, what is this a force for good or not at all, right? I think that's why the reaction is that.
I think you're right. And maybe this will add some fuel to the fire, because the reason I was excited to work with you is because I was a little bit surprised that somebody who, I suppose, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I think is perceived as progressive or left, and has a viewership that largely reflects that,
Yes.
would be a fan of cryptocurrency, because at least in the beginning, it is true that it was intended as quite a subversive project, and the target indeed was fiat government-backed currencies. That was the initial beef, and more generally the banking system. So it's not just that the government has the issuer is the issuer of the currency. It's more the way in which banking works and how it is largely invisible to the average person, but is very impacts them in very negative and tangible ways. They just don't know that someone's got their hand in their pocket.
Well, I think that that relates to, so the areas in which I'm very open to cryptocurrency would be that I recognize the ways in which the sort of financial industry, industrial complex status quo is bad for a lot of participants in the financial system. Now, I also argue that the health insurance, healthcare industrial complex status quo is bad for a lot of people. I argue that the campaign finance status quo system is bad for a lot of people. So that was my entry, the idea that there are lots of aspects of the financial system that are fundamentally not working for people. And maybe there are elements of cryptocurrency that could work to mitigate some of those imbalances. Although I also have seen serious commentaries that suggest that cryptocurrency is going to worsen wealth inequality rather than reduce it. And I think there's strong cases to be made on both sides.
It might. Personally, I'm less preoccupied with wealth inequality than I am with absolute poverty. And something that I really like about cryptocurrency is it is highly inclusive. Now, maybe you have to have the right frame of mind or the right influences or the right just be in the right place at the right time. But if you decided that you want some as a method of preserving or growing your wealth, if you think if that's one of your objectives and you think that Bitcoin can serve that purpose, you don't have to be rich. Indeed, a lot of people who today have a substantial amount of net worth got that way from buying a few $100s worth of Bitcoin in 2010 or 2011. So I do see it as highly democratizing. It's highly inclusive. It does not guarantee any kind of equal outcomes, and that I readily admit.
Well, I
And
think
and
to
the Gini
play
coefficient might even be worse.
to play
That I have
devil's
to admit.
advocate, here's a way in which it is not. So here's a way in which you could make the case that cryptocurrency is going to be a driver of inequality rather than a mitigator. Although I'm hearing you saying that absolute poverty is also a totally legitimate and valid concern. Any technology that requires, rather, any financial instrument that requires access to technology in some way, shape, or form, access to the internet, and at least some understanding of currency and currency exchange and what currency is going to keep some people sort of suppressed and out of it. Now, there are specific projects, including some that we've talked to, that are specifically working on bringing cryptocurrency as a way for very rural parts of the world that don't really have active banking or financial systems to be able to transact in the financial world outside of barter. And I think that that's really great. But at its core, some of those just minimum requirements to even be engaged in cryptocurrency, you could argue, are certainly disfavoring to the poor.
I would. I know why one might think that, but I don't agree. And maybe a good counterexample would be the rapid adoption of M-Pesa in Kenya. I think that most of their population qualifies as poor, and a large swath of their population is uneducated. And yet they were able to very quickly adopt a smartphone, or sorry, mostly flip phones, but a cell phone-based payment system that was essentially backed by cell minutes. And it took almost no time at all for them to figure out that this was useful, and they had to use technology. They had to have an internet connection, or rather a cell connection. I don't know. Maybe I don't underestimate the poor in that way. I think that they're just as capable and savvy as the rest of us. But
Well, a lot of times it's not. I mean, so sometimes there will be this argument, that there will be. So in to bring it to the American political landscape for a second, not that it necessarily applies to this, you will often see this routine. It's like predictable in the American political landscape, where someone on the political left will say, "Hey, I've identified a group that is structurally disadvantaged in this way or that way," and
mhm.
then someone from the American political right will come in and say, "You are underestimating that group, and you're wanting to help them in some way is a sort of soft bigotry." And unfortunately, it's a really effective tool for the right to sometimes suppress really important conversations about actual structural disadvantages. So it's not so much that I'm saying that the poor aren't savvy or lack intelligence or anything like that. It's a very 30,000-foot thing where if you need to understand the concept of different currencies and have the technological means to make this happen, it's a barrier to entry. It might not be an extraordinary one, but it is at least a barrier to entry.
I acknowledge that. But you also but look at like Jamie Dimon. There are rich, capable, educated people too who have been dismissing cryptocurrency for a long time. In fact,
Sure.
that's been the status quo.
Yeah.
Poor, rich, educated, uneducated, American, not American. It's almost a miracle at all that anyone sort of figured it out. Um, and yeah, I mean, you're right, but it's hard. It's hard for me because like what we provide is the absolute simplest wallet we possibly can.
Right.
And what you need is a smartphone. Like that is a physical asset you need. It might be hard for you to buy one. That's a barrier. Fair point. And then secondly, you do need a little bit of open-mindedness slash understanding of current. I think you put it as understanding of currency or multiple currencies. That too can be confusing. So I'll give you those 2 points. But I do think that those apply to the second one, at least applies to people across the spectrum. And if you have any ideas for how to make it more accessible, I'm all ears
Yeah,
because
I mean, I don't know. I don't know. One of the things that this I think also relates to is, so you and I last time talked a little bit about the word scam and scams in the
yeah.
cryptocurrency industry. And a common thing that people will write to me is they'll say, "David, it's not that we distrust your judgment when it comes to who is or isn't allowed to be a sponsor of the show. It's more that it can genuinely be difficult to know in the crypto space what is and is not a scam." Do you agree that even people within the space can be sort of tricked about what is and isn't a scam, or is it easy to figure it out?
I think it is usually easy to figure it out,
Okay.
with a couple exceptions. The most common scam. So first, I think it's just super important to make this point. Cryptocurrency itself is not a scam. There are scammers that use it to their advantage. The same way that email is not a scam, but Nigerian princes, most of them, there's probably one or two real ones. Most of the Nigerian princes are scammers.
And I think also, just before we should even make one more distinction, which is there are cryptocurrency scams that are total sham projects where there is no project, and from the get-go the idea is raise a bunch of money with an ICO and disappear. There are also projects that are well-intentioned and just never get off the ground, and that is a sort of a different category. I think it's important to point out.
I agree. So let's take the narrow scam first, which is the intent to scam. That comes generally in two flavors. One is the launching of a project for a token, and all these promises are made that are never actually intended to be fulfilled.
Right.
And then the founders run away with the money. That's a scam. That one can be hard to spot, but if you look at the promises they make, typically legitimate projects will have a reasonable roadmap, whereas the scams will just take a kitchen sink approach and say every buzzword and every cool thing that could possibly ever be done to appeal to the broadest number of people possible. So I can acknowledge that perhaps someone who wasn't close to the industry might might read or might succumb to a lot of the clever marketing, because a lot of them just pay for a ton of advertising and just get this sort of emotional have an emotional response to something. They think they don't want to miss out. That's probably the hardest one to see. The one that's easy to see and it's much more common is the super high yield investment scams, where they say they'll pay you 5% a week or 10% a month or something like that. Returns that are completely unrealistic in the real world and that just can never happen. And these are otherwise known by Ponzi schemes. Anytime you see returns like that or promises of returns or guaranteed returns of any type, you need to look very askance. The reality is, I think a lot of the people that participate in these Ponzi schemes actually know it's a Ponzi scheme. And they think they're just more clever and they'll get in and get out before the last sucker. But it doesn't always work out that way.
So you mean even some of the so-called investors, some of the people who choose to participate in an ICO or a token sale or whatever, even they to some degree know what it is that they're getting into, but they think they're going to get out of it and someone else will be left holding the bag?
I would argue it's the majority.
Wow.
Yeah.
So given the libertarian leanings of cryptocurrency and the space, who, if anyone, should do something about that to protect individuals from being the ones who get sucked in and end up holding the bag? Or should it be a sort of libertarian free market where, hey, it's buyer beware?
It might have to be the latter, just because of the way cryptocurrency works. Meaning, so I think you're probably hinting at some kind of structure and regulation, similar to how companies that do an IPO have to go through an incredible amount of documentation and crossing T's and dotting I's and auditing and all sorts of things.
Right.
Still doesn't guarantee that they're going to work out, by the way. But I think you could try. But even let me put it this way: it's already happened in large part in the U.S. The SEC has more or less said, unless you create a very clear non-security, it's probably a security. It's sort of a little bit of a warning shot. So in the U.S. at least, if you're issuing tokens and selling them, you have to be really careful because you might fall under SEC regulation. But globally, it's hard to say, because you could be two kids in South Africa, and you could be legitimate launching a project, and because it's global, there's just nothing that, like, they would just ignore any real regulation. It's unreasonable. But I mean, I'd be open to hearing what a reasonable framework would be. I will say that Hester, what's her name, at the SEC, I think she's doing a lot of good work in terms of listening to the legitimate crypto community and trying to apply light touch, reasonable regulations for cryptocurrency companies. So I actually applaud the SEC on that.
Yeah,
side.
and I also don't know what, and when you're talking about cross-national regulation, it gets very complex, and I don't actually know what it would look like. And that kind of almost gets us to like the softest version of the scam allegation, which in a way is maybe the most concerning one for the long term, because the acute scams eventually, like if the acute scams just continue, I feel like something is going to sort of break and there will be some significant change that will drastically reduce them. And maybe it's already happened, I would actually argue. But the softest version of the scam is, listen, for as long as the transaction fees on a lot of the primarily, the most prominently traded currencies are high, you're not going to use that currency for transactions day to day the way we were told, as the case may be. For as long as the transactions take a while, and this varies depending on the currency and how busy the exchanges are, that's not going to lend itself to significant adoption either, because oftentimes you need to pay right away. And for as long as the market prices of these currencies vary so wildly, it's also not a safe store of value. So like that to me is actually the strongest critique, which is like that stuff's got to be resolved if this is really going to become what many were hoping it would 3 to 5 years ago.
It does need to be resolved. I don't see any realistic way for it to resolve other than just playing out on its own.
Agreed.
Okay. Well, I was gonna say if you know a way that it could be resolved with some exogenous factor, then
No, I
I'd
don't.
be
I mean,
interested to hear
listen,
that, but I don't
you
see
know,
any other option.
my situation is that I have just sort of calculated that there's a chance that this is really going to be a significant part of the global economy at some point in the future, a bigger part than it is. So I've sort of calculated, what do I believe that that chance is, and what amount of money do I think it makes sense to sort of risk on that versus cash, real estate, my business, stocks, bonds, etc. But I sort of recognize, like, as long as things are the way are now, I don't see my cryptocurrency holdings as an investment. I really do see them as a gamble. I don't see my cryptocurrency holdings as currency I would use for transactions. I see it as, I'm just going to let it sit and sort of see what happens. But I agree with you. I don't actually know what would get that fundamental reality to change about the transaction costs to change, as well as the price fluctuations. I don't know.
I think that if we just sort of roll the tape forward, and instead of 50 to 100 million people with cryptocurrency, it's a billion.
Sure.
It will provide a stabilizing effect on price. So just taking the volatility first, over time, if more people adopt it in a similar fashion to yourself, whether they call it a gamble or an investment or a speculation, it doesn't really matter as long as it's in the hands of more people. The volatility will go down over time, and I think that maybe addresses the store value issue. The spending part, I think it's a little different because people do like to spend it when it goes up in price after a certain point. So there's sort of this switching point during these bubbles where all these holders become sellers and or spenders. It stands to reason that if you had $1,000 last year and now it's $100,000, that you won't mind, buying a nice steak dinner. I think you can still have this payment dynamic regardless of the price that will, and indeed, like I use it. I mean, I pay my neighbor to walk my dog every day in Bitcoin, and she loves it. And she tells me every day how close she is to the next goal that she's set, and she doesn't care what the price is. Now I understand that's not like a mainstream use case, and not everyone feels that way. But yeah, I mean, it's one of those things where, like, I would probably agree with you if I didn't have any data, but if you just look at the public blockchains, people are using them all the time. And so they just do. And that's a fact.
As far as the transaction fees, if the user base goes from 100 million to a billion, what happens to transaction speeds and transaction times?
It depends on the coin. Bitcoin's the biggest, and so that's the one that's getting the most pressure. I really don't know, David.
Because that is an issue, right? Because we're
It
talking
is.
about
Yeah.
the volatility. Volatility will go down if you go from 100 million to a billion users. But we saw during the $19,000 Bitcoin bubble in December of, I guess it was 17, that fees were absolutely off the charts, and that could again become a problem.
Yes. The good news is that there are a lot of ways out of the woods. It's not that we don't know how to solve it. It's that different solutions have different trade-offs. One solution is that people just use intermediaries. Like, I'll give you an example. So Coinbase is one of the largest Bitcoin cryptocurrency companies. And if you have your money with them, you can send money to friends that are also with them for no fees.
Right.
So they'll just debit and credit Bitcoin balances. And then if you want to actually hold the Bitcoin, which we encourage, and that's the solution we provide, then you do have to pay a transaction fee, or a transaction fee has to be paid for the network. But like I said, different coins do different things. So Bitcoin Cash was the brother or sister of Bitcoin, however you want to look at it. They parted ways, and it was largely over this issue of transaction fees. And as things stand today, Bitcoin Cash has more capacity for transactions than Bitcoin. Whether or not that will give it a competitive edge, time will tell. But you asked the second question, which was time to complete transactions. Again, depends on the coin. Ethereum is really quick to get a confirmation. Bitcoin and Bitcoin Cash have an average 10-minute interval, and if the networks are jammed up, then your transaction might get punted a few more intervals forward. So it could be hours or days sometimes. And it's not a good experience. It's not a good thing. So that, I mean, that's part of why I enjoy this industry so much, is you just, every coin gets to compete on its own merits, and then we'll see what happens.
We will indeed, and we've been seeing. I mean, over the last, I guess I noticed it only a few days ago, but I guess there's been a bit of a rally in a lot of the coin prices over the last week or so, and immediately, I start to get texts from people saying, "What are you doing? What are you doing?" And usually my answer is, number one, I have no advice for you.
Right.
And number two, I'm doing
Right
nothing.
answer.
I'm doing nothing. I'm just waiting. And if it goes back down, I'll regret not having sold. And if it goes up, I'll feel like I actually know what I'm doing.
Right.
Is there, I mean, when you see these rallies and declines and everybody starts commenting on what it is that's going on, nobody knows, right? I mean, nobody has any idea.
Not really.
Yeah. Sort of
I mean,
like with the
I
stock
think
market.
I think I do, but no, yeah, it's like the stock market, particularly the shorter the time frame.
Yeah.
So what's happening tomorrow or the next day, no one knows. Now, long term, you have a better chance, right? If you sort of do the math in your head and think how much can cryptocurrency carve out of the rest of the economy in terms of value, and you look 5, 10, 20 years ahead, you'll do better that way, because it cancels out all the noise. But yeah, in the short term, good luck.
We have been speaking with Aaron Lasher, who is the co-founder and chief strategy officer at BRD. Aaron, I really do appreciate you talking to me again. I think it was a very interesting conversation.
Thanks for having me on again, David.